Other than Turkey, Europe is exploring various ways to pump more gas to Ukraine. Then joining us now to discuss this further is Kent Morris, professor at the Department of Political Science at Duquesne University. He's also president of ASIDA, a global oil and gas consulting firm, and the founder and editor of the Oil and Energy Investor. Kent, good to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle.
So Ukraine says that it aims to use EU-bound pipelines to get gas from Slovakia in a so-called reverse mode to supply its domestic needs. The EU, Slovakia, and Ukraine met today, and they failed to come to a conclusive agreement. Kent, what are the sticking points here?
Well, there are a number. Number one, even if this entire project works, the amount of volume of natural gas going into Ukraine is quite insufficient to solve Ukrainian problems. There are two primary pipelines at issue in Slovakia. There is one they could use in a reverse flow, but at best you get only 10 billion cubic meters a year, which is less than a third of what Ukraine needs. The trunk pipeline, on the other hand, is contracted away for at least 20 years to Gazprom. And Gazprom, from Russia, in their contracts to every end user, has a specific clause which prohibits the resale of the natural gas purchased from Russia. So that's a no-go from the very beginning. The ability to bring it in from Slovakia is a possibility, but that's not going to solve the problem that Ukraine has, especially as we get into the need to build up stockpiles in advance of the winter.
So, as you mentioned, Slovakia says it needs permission from Russia. Either way, Slovakia doesn't have enough supplies. What are the options here for Ukraine?
There are very few options short term. There is some domestic development that's ongoing. They do have shale gas in western Ukraine, but it's going to take some time to bring that online. Some of the more livable options at the moment would be, for example, bringing in liquefied petroleum gas into Odessa or other ports in southern Ukraine. But LNG plants they were talking about for years. If we were to start building them tomorrow, they're not going to be online for 3 or 4 years. The ability to bring American liquefied natural gas into Europe and thereby bring it into Ukraine is a greater possibility, but that's at least a year and a half away. So there really are very few options at the moment.
And in the meantime, Kent, Russia is putting the squeeze on the Ukraine. Gazprom presented Ukraine with an additional $11 billion bill today. How likely is it that Russia will actually just cut off the Ukraine?
Well, I think it's somewhat more unlikely now than it was in 2006 and again in 2009. There is considerable European opposition to this, and Russia does have a vested interest in not turning off the Western European market. The primary beneficiary from this increasing tension and any likelihood that Moscow would cut off the flow is likely to be China, because that's the only other outlet that Russia will have for its gas if the difficulties continue in Europe.
So Europe does hold some cards in this negotiating scenario?
It does. Russia for years, Gazprom in particular, has tried to acquire assets in Western Europe, which the EU has not allowed. But the EU since 2009 has begun to diversify its own sources. It now brings in far more LNG than it ever did. The Rotterdam Gate in the Netherlands is now open. It's the largest LNG receiving facility in the world. The capacity for receiving LNG in Western Europe now is about twice as much as the LNG they're actually receiving. So they do have some possibility of increasing capacity there. And nations like Qatar and North Africa would be the primary immediate sources.
But in the meantime, Ken, still Russia is providing Europe with roughly 1/3 of its gas imports, and about 40% of that flows through the Ukraine, and it delivers around half of the Ukraine's domestic gas needs. So is Russia still holding the majority of the cards here?
Well, I think Russia has the upper hand. Actually, the amount that's going across Ukraine is now greatly been reduced. It's only about 15% of what it is that Europe uses on a daily basis. And that's because you have the Nord Stream pipeline directly from Russia below the Baltic to northern Germany that is now up and operating. So the amount of Russian gas that Europe needs is still considerable, but the amount that's coming across Ukraine is less than it has been in previous years, and that does give Russia a certain advantage.
Well, the tensions between Ukraine and Russia have led Gazprom to increase its prices to Ukraine by 81%. Germany is Gazprom's second largest customer. Do you see Gazprom doing a price increase to other European countries?
I think that's inevitable. It's going to be a pass-on. With Ukraine, of course, they had a discounted rate on the contract that was negotiated as far back as Prime Minister Tymoshenko before she got into her political difficulties. And now, of course, all bets are off between Moscow and Kiev. They're reverting to the much higher pricing formula. And remember how it is that Gazprom prices these formulas. These are 20-year contracts. They're, as you've mentioned already, take-or-pay contracts. You have to pay for a certain volume whether you use it or not. And the price is based on a basket of crude oil and oil products. As oil goes up, and we've been seeing Brent crude go up, so does the pass-on price for natural gas. So things are simply going to get more expensive for Ukraine, at least in the short term.